When I was invited to speak in Odessa, Florida, I was reminded that it is Pride Month, and the suggestion was made that I try to mention that theme, which really just flooded me with memories. When I was still a denominational pastor in the Christian church, I was called to a big church in Springfield, Missouri in the summer of 1991. And the city was still embroiled in a controversy that had been sparked by a play performed at the local state university called The Normal Heart that dealt with the spread of the HIV virus and AIDS in the LGBTQ plus community. So at my very first board meeting as a young pastor in a big church, an elderly lady on the board, ironically, a woman I later learned had shared her home with another adult woman for her entire life, rose to demand of me, just what are you going to do about the homosexual problem? I'd only been in town for a week, but I already knew this question wasn't just about the public controversy about the play. I knew that the unspoken challenge had to do with the rumor that was rife in the church that our associate pastor was gay. The major theme for the next 10 years of my life was mapped out in that moment, in that challenge, in that board meeting. My decision that night, just without any forethought, planning, or time to think about it, was that I was going to have to do whatever I had to do to protect Reverend Charlie from the lynching I saw in the eyes of several board members. And that necessarily led me into a years-long circuit of speaking invitations in university classrooms, seminary classes, along with TV and radio interviews and newspaper columns, all about religion and sexual orientation. You would think that I was the first person to discover that it was possible to be religious and not homophobic in Springfield, Missouri. All of us who are straight but are supporters of gay rights probably have a story to tell about our own journey out of the prejudice that we likely inherited in our family home, and the steps that we had to take to escape from the prison of prejudice. And I'd love to hear your stories, but today, oddly enough, I have the microphone and this is not two-way communication. I grew up in the Christian church in the little county seat town of Glasgow, Kentucky. I don't recall the issue of homosexuality even being mentioned until I was in college. The prejudice that was a part of daily conversation in my growing up years in school, in my own home, in my neighborhood, was racial prejudice. And so with your permission, I'd like to start there. And to start there, I want to share a story with you that I heard from the late Fred Craddock. He told this story at a convention in Texas more than 40 years ago. Fred was a famous preacher in those days, and as a great storyteller, you can generally assume that his stories are not historically factual, but as it turns out, his stories are very true. He told us about a little boy named Jimmy who lived in this little Texas town where it happened that all the little boys his age that would play with him in the neighborhood, they were all black. And this was uncomfortable for Jimmy's white parents, but he was just a kid. Kids are going to play, so they just never said anything about it. Jimmy was also unique as kids go because Jimmy loved going to church. He loved the stained glass windows. He loved the way that the pipe organ would make the old oak pews vibrate. He loved the choir processing with their colorful robes. He loved everything about it, from the women in hats and gloves right down to the preacher's sweaty red face when he got all tuned up when he was preaching. The only thing that bothered him about his church was that his friends couldn't come with him. They were always just left outside, sitting on the church steps, waiting for Jimmy to come out so they could start playing again. But Jimmy just couldn't understand why his friends couldn't come inside with him. The subject came up at Sunday dinner almost every week when Jimmy would demand an explanation. "Daddy, why can't my friends come to church with me?" "You're too young to understand, son. It's just the way things are." "But Daddy, couldn't they come just once?" "Hush up now, son. Eat your dinner before it gets cold." One week there was a funeral at church, and as always, Jimmy was there, and he saw all the people at the funeral and noticed that many of them were not people who were usually at church. So that night at dinner, he asked again, "Daddy, when I die, can my friends come to my funeral?" "What are you talking about, son? You're not going to die." No, Daddy. Tell me, when I die, can my friends come to my funeral?" "Hush up, boy. You're upsetting your mother." "Daddy, I need to know, can my friends come to my funeral?" "Well, I suppose so. Now, let it go. We're eating." The people in town didn't know. Was it an accident? Why did Jimmy just run out in front of that truck like that? The whole town was in shock. 3 days later, the church was packed for the funeral, and Jimmy's little friends were sitting there on the front row of the church when the preacher stood up to deliver the eulogy. He began saying, I don't know. I don't know if it was an accident. I don't know if Jimmy ran out in front of that truck on purpose. But I'll tell you this. This town only had one prophet, and now he's dead. You see, the thing about prejudice is that for most people, it's almost entirely unconscious. I grew up in the American apartheid of segregated schools, segregated churches, restrooms, and water fountains. But by the time I was old enough to stand and turn a bale of hay or set a tobacco plant, I worked on the farm now and then with the black kids of the tenant farmer that lived on the farm. But it never even occurred to me that I never saw those same kids in my school or at my church. I never thought about it until one day in the 5th grade when 8 or 9 frightened young black kids were escorted into my classroom as the integration of public schools began in a fog of confusion and fear. I remember the day when the municipal swimming pool was integrated and my mother came to pick me and my brother up, and she was horrified to see us in the water with black kids. She literally took us home and demanded that we bathe immediately and scrub ourselves hard in case, honestly, I really don't know in case of what, if there was some peculiar black germ that could have gotten on us through the water. But it was a hot summer that year, and she had to relent pretty quickly to let us go back to the pool. Prejudice, whether it's conscious or unconscious, becomes a shorthand way in which we navigate through the world without having to think about everything all the time. Prejudice doesn't go away the first time it's challenged. And when you think it's all over, when you think you're past it, something happens that makes you realize that it's still hiding where you didn't know it was. We got through school integration, the integration of the pool, the Little League baseball teams, department stores and restrooms. But I was home one weekend from college and sat on the sofa watching TV with my family. The Dick Van Dyke Show was on, and in this iteration of the Dick Van Dyke Show, they had a college-age son who brought his black girlfriend home to meet his TV sitcom family. And that's when I discovered where the reserve of prejudice was hiding in my family. When that show was over, my father turned to me and my brother and told us that if we ever dated a black girl, that we would find all of our stuff out in the driveway and to not even come inside to say goodbye. When he said that to me, I impulsively stood up, walked over to the phone on the kitchen wall, and I called Marcia Troutman, a girl in my speech class in college, the prettiest and blackest young woman I'd ever met, and I asked her out to dinner that night. I left to pick her up for dinner and then came home to see if my clothes would be in the driveway. They were not, and the subject never came up again. I was infected with racial prejudice. Folks, I'm only 5 generations removed from slave traders in southern Kentucky. It was a part of my family inheritance. But that night, I had decided that I was going to break the chain. I'm confident that my father died a racist, but I also know that he died knowing that he had not been able to pass that poison on to me. Before he died, I had adopted a little brown girl from Korea, and my dad had to pretend like he liked her at least a little bit for the next 20 years. Now, I spent 16 years in this church in Missouri, defending Reverend Charlie and other members of the church who were part of the LGBTQ plus community. For more than a decade, I was the only Christian pastor in town who conducted same-sex weddings before they were legally recognized. Now, my church board wouldn't let me have a same-sex wedding inside the church. Even though we had grown through the years, we had gay elders and deacons, we had gay Sunday school teachers, and from time to time there were protesters marching up and down the sidewalk in front of the church. There were 2 different times, separated by a few years, when a cinder block was thrown through the windshield of my car while it was parked in the church parking lot. There were death threats, there were nasty letters. At first, I did same-sex weddings far out of town in little resort communities in the lakes in southern Missouri and northern Arkansas. And then, as it got to be more accepted, I did them in restaurants and in homes there in Springfield, Missouri. There was one time even when I asked at a board meeting that when a gay person puts a donation in the collection plate, do we put that money in a separate fund, or does that get to go in with the rest of all the straight donations? They didn't really get it, but I kept making my point. So at long last, it was 2007 when I finally had permission to do a same-sex wedding inside the church sanctuary. And coincidentally, I was fired 3 months later. May or may not have been connected. The board meeting that fired me lasted well past midnight, and though there were no visible torches and pitchforks, there was a lot of anger that was emboldened by ignorance. And that night I vowed that I would never go to church again. But thankfully, there was a Unitarian church where I could take refuge, and as many of my critics assured me at the time, well, Unitarians are not really a church anyway, are they? The church went into steep decline as they continued to battle internally with what they had done to me. They fired a few more people over the next few years, but in the end, my vindication came when they hired a married gay pastor, because evidently, even though it was controversial for me, the controversy was finally worked out, and the prejudice is what finally got ejected from the church. Now, I apologize if I've made this sound something like Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves without the help of all the black activists and prophets of his day. It wasn't like that. It wasn't all me, and there were an awful lot of really fine gay and lesbian and trans folk who paid a much bigger and much more personal price than I did as we saw that slow transformation that took place over nearly 20 years. The gist of what I'm saying, though, is that things did get better. There's still racial prejudice in America, but America is not what it was in the 1960s. There is still homophobia in America, but most gay people can now be out and proud without fear of losing their job or being alienated from their family. But you know, we had Roe v. Wade in place for 50 years that granted women autonomy over their own bodies. And one summer, just a few years ago, that was taken away. We finally won victories in the arena of gay marriage and gay and trans folk getting to serve in the military. But already the trans soldiers are being told to pack up and get out. And we have a Supreme Court justice who has articulated his desire to overturn the decision that legalized same-sex marriage. It's true that we've made a lot of progress in the past 2 generations, but that arc of the moral universe that Martin Luther King talked about, it doesn't bend towards justice in a straight line. In the past 2 generations, for women, for minorities, for the LGBTQ community, things have gotten better, but nothing is certain. We cannot take any of our liberties or successes for granted. In the past decade, my most favorite churches around the country have become smaller and weaker, and most are barely holding on to existence or have already closed their doors. But if ever there was a time when all of our towns needed a prophet, isn't this that time? Will the prophets come from our churches? Could they be politicians or statesmen? God help me, could it be a child? Just a kid who loves his black friends, or his gay uncle, or his pregnant big sister? Who is going to speak up? Who will be a voice for the voiceless? I'll close today with a few lines from the Irish musician Theo Bard, who wrote the song Fickle World of Change. In the 3rd verse, he asks, "Can you stand up and be counted as a body in a crowd? Put your name on a petition with your signature so proud? Can you raise your voice so loud as you stand with head unbowed when they are beating on your brow, demanding answers here and now? Because that's how you make a difference in this fickle world of change."
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.